Start recording. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the League of Women Voters of Stanislaus County's Meet and Learn session, also called Zoom and Learn. So happy to have so many people here. This is great. This is sort of a continuation of an emphasis we've had on learning more about criminal justice reform. In our league, it's also a state issue that we've done state study on. And we have had some meetings in the past on both the what we're going to be talking about tonight, Forward Together, and also Project Resolve, the sheriff's system of working on this issue. So it's really great to have you all here, and we're going to be starting out with Kate Trompetter, who is going to be presenting for us. She's brought in a couple of guests who will also be part of this presentation, mainly to talk about the Forward Together committee recommendations and how we're going forward with Forward Together. So I guess I didn't introduce myself. I'm Julie Saugstad. I'm the Vice President of League of Women Voters of Stanislaus County. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kate at this point.
Thank you, Julie. You're also Andy's mom.
Yes, I am.
Who I went to elementary school with.
I've known Kate a while.
Yeah. I'm delighted to be back with everybody. I know some of you, not all of you. I'm going to do a couple quick introductions and then we'll get into the content for the evening. So with me tonight, I have Chief Brandon Gillespie, who is not likely a stranger to many or all of you. So he'll have a part of this presentation in just a little bit. And I also have Allison Van Gilder, who's the newest Deputy City Manager with the City of Modesto, who maybe bravely took on the role after Kalua Barnes, who started this initiative, retired to Portugal. Is that where she is? Where is she? Yeah, Portugal. We should all be so lucky. So delighted to have Allison here too to answer questions on behalf of the city, with whom the recommendations now rest. So we'll get her in on the end of this conversation. The last introduction I'll just make, which I'm sure she wasn't prepared for, is Talitha Agan, who I'm really excited is the newest member of my team of consultants and coaches doing this kind of work throughout Stanislaus County. So very glad. I mean, she literally started a week ago today. So with all that said, I wanted to also just confirm that if anyone has questions, they can put it in the chat. And I'm going to present with the chief and with Allison for the next bit of time. And then once we're done with our presentation, we're happy to go through questions as they arise in the chat. So is that correct, Julie?
Yes, that's
my understanding of that.
Please.
Excellent. Excellent. Great. So one thing that I'd like to do, many of you were with us the last time I was here last month, and we presented on Project Resolve, which, as Julie said, I want to make just like a quick distinction between these two projects. Project Resolve was in fact started by Sheriff Jeff Dirksey. It now belongs to a countywide initiative called Focus on Prevention. So it doesn't necessarily belong to any one law enforcement institution. It's not time-bound. Project Resolve is really designed to be an ongoing engagement of every law enforcement executive in the county, along with community leaders and organizations who are just continuing to monitor and assess and learn about what it takes to create trust and strong relationships between community and law enforcement. The Forward Together initiative was certainly informed by the work that's been happening in Project Resolve, and it was a City of Modesto-centric initiative that was time-bound and had very clear directives, and that's what we're here to talk about tonight. I also understand that you have a particular interest in one of the focus areas, which was on alternate response models. So we're going to get a little deeper into that work in our, what I hope will feel brief and very enlightening and exciting presentation. So what I'd like to do is just start off with a little bit of information about how we started. So is everybody seeing the PowerPoint? Just confirmation, nodding heads, thumbs up. You're all such experienced, skilled Zoom participants. I appreciate that. So many of you may or may not know that back in May of 2021, we hosted a listening session. So the Modesto City Council invited the community to come to the council chambers in a meeting that was dedicated just to hearing the public's concerns on policing in the city of Modesto. And that lasted all day. It was facilitated by myself. I had the support throughout this entire process of my colleague, Michael Baldwin, who also does a lot of work with law enforcement throughout Modesto and the county, and actually in lots of other places now too. After that listening session was done, the council formed and established the Forward Together working group. The way that they did that was that they put out an invitation to the list of organizations that you see here on the screen. And just like last month, we'll make sure you have a copy of this PowerPoint after the presentation is over so that you can look at it in more detail. But their intention was as best as possible to reach the many different stakeholder groups that would have an interest or certainly an opinion about policing in the city of Modesto. So I'll just call out that we had, and I apologize, I probably should have spelled all of these things out. You know, we get very used to acronyms in a lot of our work, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with the NAACP. NAMI is the National Association on Mental Illness, and the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, El Concilio, Modesto City Schools. You could see that they tried to cast their net wide, and we invited those organizations to nominate one person to join the work group. So those organizations agreed to participate. They nominated their one person. The work group was essentially formed. Where you see an asterisk, I would just point out that we had the participation and support of our public defender, the Stanislaus County Behavioral Health and Recovery Services, our Sheriff's Department, and the district attorney, who were not voting members. So they didn't necessarily weigh in on the recommendations once they were complete, but they were there to inform us and educate us as the work group did their work. The last thing I'll say is that early in the process, we got feedback that having the community having an opportunity to just apply for those community members who would be interested that are not connected to these stakeholder groups felt really important to continue that commitment to like diverse representation, viewpoints and all. So we did go through a process of putting out the opportunity for folks to apply and then interview, and the work group itself selected 4 additional community members to join the work group, totaling 27 people. So once that was done, Michael Baldwin and I, along with the city of Modesto and the police department, went to work. The intention was that based on the listening session, the council wanted the work group to pay attention to 3 big buckets. So they wanted recommendations at the end of 1 year, approximately, on policies and procedures, whether or not they supported safety, fairness, and equity throughout the department and within the community. They wanted the group to review alternate response models, which was really about assuring that the right type of response and resources are applied to a situation. And that largely came from a cry for those who were experiencing a mental health crisis and didn't need to engage with armed sworn officers, that there would be an alternative to that. And then the third area was around accountability. And they wanted the group. So I want to be clear that the city council didn't say, go build us a citizen oversight committee. They said, we want you to assess and research whether or not the appropriate accountability structures are in place for police conduct decisions and how they impact the Modesto community. So that was their charge. The design was such that we formed the work group. We had our 3 areas that we needed to pay attention to, and the group committed to about 1 meeting a month from July through August. So they met for a little over a year. And then in between those once a month meetings, which were subject to the Brown Act, which meant they had to be posted, within 72 hours, the public was invited. Every meeting was live streamed on YouTube. And you could join via Zoom. In most cases, you could join in person. There was always public comment, so on and so forth. The other thing that we did was we broke the team, the full work group, into ad hoc groups at the recommendation of Michael and I. It was important to us, and I know there were people who struggled with this, but that some of the very sort of tense and messy conversations that you might imagine need to happen around policing in community, that those conversations could happen in a place where folks weren't feeling like they were in a fishbowl and being watched by the many people in this community who had a lot of interest in this. But then those ad hoc groups would then come back to the large group and report out about their discussions and what they learned and what direction they were heading in. The other thing that happened in between the monthly meetings was that we encouraged our law enforcement partners to sit with work group members and for our work group members to sit with law enforcement. So lots of coffee dates and conversations. Also, our community members and our stakeholder groups went on ride-alongs. They did scenario training. They did their own reading. We had one member who bought a book for everybody in the work group. They did their own research and had their own conversations. So it's important that I think I point that out for a lot of reasons. The recommendations, they don't come by them lightly. They spent a lot of time and energy, and this was no small commitment of time that all of these people volunteered as a participant in the work group. So I'm not going to go through all the information on this slide, but I thought, it's a best practice not to put too many words on a PowerPoint slide, right? But it felt important to illustrate just the sheer amount of data and information that this group engaged with over the approximately 13 months of doing their work. So in the areas of policies and practices, you can see that they received data comparing training standards. They just received data on traffic stops, use of force. They received a booklet. They have binders that are, very thick, containing the policies and practices, procedures for all of Modesto Police Department. The police department was very responsive to their requests for data to be disaggregated in different ways and to ask questions and learn. We had law enforcement in our meetings answering questions the whole time. And then in the areas of alternate response, they received lots of updates and information about what programs, practices were already in place, the current conversations they were already having with Stanislaus County Behavioral Health and Recovery Services, certain innovations that were already happening in addition, not just locally, but as many of you may have been aware, Cahoots is a model that many people have been paying attention to, but there are models across the state and the country that folks were researching and getting information on in regards to making sure the appropriate response and resources are deployed to any situation. In the area of accountability, we had one meeting dedicated to just presentations from folks who have stood up and been running civilian oversight models throughout the state of California and the use of independent auditors. They also received a lot of data and information about just the standard practice, how an investigation works and the people and departments that it moves through before any decisions are made. So they received these big educational presentations in the full group space, and then in their ad hoc groups, they go and really dig into more of the details. And then in general, I'll just say that these are other things that as we went along, either the PD thought, the police department thought, oh, we should offer this to them, or the work group said, can we please have this additional information? And it was then provided to them. So it was about the beginning of the calendar year that the recommendations started to take shape. So you have the three areas here: accountability, policies, practices, and alternate response models. I want to just very briefly talk about where we landed, where the group landed with accountability, policies, and practices. So the report is available online. I can also make sure that when I send the PowerPoint to Julie or whomever, that the forward together recommendations are included in that. If, sometimes, no offense, Allison, but like government websites can be a little hard to navigate. So one of the things that happened in the policies and practices group was that very quickly they got to a place of overwhelm. It simply wasn't enough time in the conditions that have been created in these work groups for them to review every policy and practice of the police department and make recommendations about whether or not they were leading to equitable outcomes and, those sorts of things. At the same time, our accountability group was having conversations about the possibility of, a review board or civilian oversight. And very quickly, these groups aligned on this idea that if we established a civilian oversight board or a review board, whatever, the name is something that's still up for grabs, right? That really it should be part of the scope of work for this board to continue the work of reviewing policies and practices. That is a standard practice across, other communities where they have these types of civilian boards, to spend time in policies and practices and reviewing those and asking questions, before, after critical incidents, anytime. So that felt like a really good solution to all involved, that we just say a structure like this needs to continue, and that can happen inside an oversight or review board. So the other thing that came out of that is the interest in hiring an independent auditor. So I know that your interest tonight is primarily in the alternate response model, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, but I can say that I'm certainly available to talk about this. I think I say with confidence that Allison or the chief would also be very happy to talk about what we're learning. But what I will say is that just at the end of September, the city manager's office, Allison's office, did a bunch of research because we handed the forward together recommendations back to the city, which is what we were asked to do. And the manager's office has now taken it upon themselves to research what implementation looks like. So we got a round of feedback on September 29th, and the next steps are that on December 13th, the city manager's office is coming back with the framework. This is what a civilian oversight board will look like. Here's how we think people should be selected. Here's the scope of work. Here's what it'll cost for an independent auditor, and then the council will vote. So you can put that in your calendars if you would like to. So I'm going to just dive into the alternate response models, and then I'm going to pass this over to the chief, who knows a lot more about this than I do. This was by far the group that came together the fastest. So in terms of being aligned on possible recommendations, what you'll see in a second is that Modesto Police Department had already started a good deal of work on the idea of alternative responses, had already been talking with the county behavioral health and recovery services and mental health system providers. And so what the recommendations were that came out of Forward Together were essentially keep doing what you're doing, do more of it. And by the way, City Council, make this a permanent line item in your budget, because right now most of these things are grant funded, which means, as many of you know, at any moment, the funding could be gone and we won't get refunded for this kind of really important work. So the chief's going to go into a little bit more detail about these things, chat, and the idea of MCERT and what that means. But the group essentially said, scale up what you're doing. Please use really good data that tells us whether or not anyone's better off because we're doing this work in a different way, and continue the work you're doing with the countywide behavioral health system to address the needs of this community. So in the report, you'll see there's a little bit more detail just about the launching and scaling up and what that would mean. These are all programs that I'll invite the chief to talk about. But you can see a lot of this is about money. And that really, what it came down to is that our ability to do this work, it's that it needs to be resourced. And so there's a couple other things I'll just call out in here that they would also like: just a crisis response stakeholder group, which could include some content experts about what it means for folks to do crisis response in the community for those who are experiencing a mental health crisis. They had some recommendations about the number of hours that should be required for the crisis intervention training that our officers receive, in addition to civilian personnel. They had some recommendations about upgrading technology, and that there be a deep connection to any civilian oversight, just ongoing reflection and checking in with community about how this work is going. So I'm going to invite Chief Gillespie to talk a little bit about what was happening that predated the formation of the Forward Together Committee and what the data was telling them.
Great, thank you, Kate. And again, my name is Brandon Gillespie, the chief of the Modesto Police Department. And really, we've been talking about having some type of outreach workers integrated with our police department for some time. And actually, it was in October of 2020 that we were able to actually get some funding. We got it through HUD, and we were able to leverage $800,000 to start a program to hire 4 full-time outreach workers. And so as anything, you have to develop job specs and things like that. So we actually didn't get them started until April to May of 2021. And then really looked at, if anybody's familiar with the program Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, we really looked, and we actually went up there and visited to see how they integrate social workers into their response to police calls that don't need a police officer. And so really in September of last year is when we really started kind of hitting the ground with those 4 full-time outreach workers. And that's what we've been doing. This slide here shows kind of the data-driven approach, what we used to get there. So what we did with this is we took a look at all of what we call our quality of life crimes. So we looked at things like our municipal code violations, for illegal camping, panhandling, trespassing, different things like that that are often we see with our homeless population or those that have mental health issues. And we took all of those calls for service. And then we took and looked at all of our calls for service, and we did a keyword searches. It was over, I think, around 56 different keywords that we searched all of our calls for service to see what kind of mental health calls we were responding to. And so we used words like schizophrenic and bipolar and any word related to mental health that we could think of, and did another search. And we came up with about 19,000 calls for service that we get every single year that we believe potentially could have an alternate response model. It wouldn't necessarily need a police officer to respond to. It might be more appropriate to have a social worker or a mental health clinician respond. And so once we had that 19,000 number, then we did a keyword search, which was another 50 something, again, around 56 keywords that had words related to weapons, fight, knife, gun, things like that, that would indicate that there was a safety issue related to that call for service, and then separated those. And what we found was about 12,000 of the calls for service between quality of life and mental health did not have any safety words, keywords that would indicate that would necessarily need a police officer. But about 7,000 of those calls did have some type of keyword that would indicate there was a safety concern, and it wouldn't be appropriate to send just social workers to that call. And so we use that as kind of the basis to say, hey, if we're going to stand up a program like Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, or alternative response model, where we're just having social worker, mental health clinicians respond, what does that look like? And we wanted to be data driven in our approach. So that's what we did. And so with that HUD funding, like I talked about, we got it approved in October of 2020. We hired the first 4 in April of 2021. And then they began handling calls for service in between there, but it was in September or end of October that we started, we went to Eugene, Oregon, visited the Cahoots program. And so I would say September is when we really started having them handle calls for service. And we look at like our success. And one of the measures we use for success is how many calls are they diverting away from police officers having to handle? And we'll get into some of that here in a minute. But we knew that 4 wasn't going to be enough. So we leveraged some ARPA money in the summer of 2022, and we're able to hire 2 more homeless outreach workers, or outreach specialists is what we're calling them, to bring our numbers up to 6 full-time workers. They work in pairs of 2, so that's 3 2-person teams, and that's what we currently have right now. But knowing that funding is always an issue, ARPA money was only for 2 years for the outreach workers. The HUD funding actually ends at the end December of this year. We knew we had to leverage more funding to try to have a longer term plan. So there's another board that is a countywide board called the Community Corrections Partnership. And that's the sheriff, myself, the public defender, the district attorney, and we get money from the state to reduce recidivism. We know homelessness and mental health issues, there's a big recidivism rate amongst that population. So we were recently able to leverage money to provide 5 years of funding when the HUD and the ARPA money runs out, to actually hire 12 total homeless outreach specialists. It would be 10 workers and 2 supervisors. And then also a crime analyst, because we want to be data driven and collect the data to show what works and what doesn't. And then also add 2 mobile crisis emergency team, which the acronym is MCERT, clinicians, to ride out with our officers in a co-response model. And what that is those 7,000 calls that have some type of safety issue, we still believe there's a benefit to having someone with mental health experience often respond with our officers. So what we're starting up, we've been in the hiring phase. This is a reimbursement program that we have with Behavioral Health Services, BHRS, with the county. They've just hired some clinicians. We actually hope to start this program up in next month in November. We had it for several years, but it ended in 2017 due to some staffing and funding issues back then. So that model will have a clinician paired with a police officer, and they will handle calls for service. But when mental health type calls come in, they will be specifically dispatched to go to those type of calls so we can have a mental health clinician on scene. So our hope is that as we continue to expand these programs, well, twofold. We want to put the right, I have a philosophy here that if it needs a police officer, we want to send a police officer. If it doesn't need a police officer, I want to send a different resource. And so it will actually hopefully free up our police officers to do more of what we need our police officers to be doing, which is crime fighting. And when appropriate, send either our chat team, which is the 2 social workers together to handle a call, or if it's more appropriate because of a safety issue, send a police officer in the co-response model with a mental health clinician. So is there another slide, Kate? Some data, and then I'll quit talking and turn it back over to Kate or open up the questions. But what we're looking at data, we want to know if we're successful. So far year to date this year, our chat team, and just recently got up to 6. We had 4 for many months of the year, has handled 1,405 calls for service. Of that, 1,007 of those calls for service were diverted directly to chat. So they had 1,400 calls that they responded to in general, but 1,007 of those never even touched the police officer. So it went through the 911 system. It was identified as being appropriate for chat. Chat went and handled the call, and our police officers were never involved. 1,059 of those calls for service of the 1,400 were labeled what we call nuisance calls. Those are typically your illegal camping, panhandling, a lot related to illegal or homelessness or mental health, low-level mental health type of things. So of those 1,400 calls, 1,059 of those were nuisance calls, and chat handled 856 of those without, which is 82% of those without a sworn officer. So that is good data that really helps us show that this program is being successful, that it is diverting calls, and that we can use social workers to handle calls for service that police officers don't need to be at. Things we also look at so we can start doing mathematical calculations to see how many ultimately do we need. We're looking at their average time spent on a call is 31 minutes per team. And then on top of the calls that they go to, that they get dispatched to, we all know, they know where the hotspots are, where are kind of high homeless areas that are often getting called in by the public. So they'll go proactively go to those areas, and prior to a call having to be generated by our community, they'll actually proactively go out and do what we call self-initiated activity. And so year to date so far, there have been 979 self-initiated activity calls that they have responded to in addition to the dispatch calls for service that they've been to. And of those, 413 of the self-initiated activity calls have been related to nuisance calls, predominantly our homeless population. So some of the data, an overview of where that went, and turn it back over to you, Kate.
Cool, thanks, Chief. So just a reminder that we're gonna, this is the slide that's coming, the anticipation. It's the last one. So if you have questions, very happy to see those showing up in the chat, and we can get into the Q&A. So that's just a bit of an overview of sort of what's been happening. There's, where the council needs to vote on the civilian oversight and the independent auditor. There's much of this work that just requires us to be paying attention to how resources are allocated and allow the police department and the county behavioral health and recovery services to do the work that they're doing. And the hope of the Forward Together work group is that the city council is paying attention to, using budget, the dollars in the budget to reinforce this good work, as long as the data is telling us that it works, right? Next steps are, so this first part we already talked about. We're in the implementation phase. So as I just said, that the recommendations have landed with the city council, and now they're in the city manager's office. So you're welcome, Allison. And the city manager's office is conducting their own research about, what do these recommendations mean budgetarily? What do they mean, from a staffing and other resources perspective? Many of our Forward Together work group members are still engaged, even though their work is formally done. Even now, the city manager's office and I are working together to think about the criteria for how someone might end up on a civilian oversight board, and working with some of the Forward Together members to collect feedback from them about their opinions, their stakeholder groups, and what they may think. So again, that vote, the City Council voting on whether to move forward with the independent auditor and the Civilian Oversight Committee is happening on December 13th. And the alternative response or alternate response methods are in process. So I see Julie, yes, is an independent auditor recommended as well as a citizens committee. It is. And I can invite Allison and or the chief to speak to this, but it's what's called a hybrid model. The group has heard from many different places and people who are running civilian oversight and or independent auditors as a part of their city practice. And the recommendation is for us to be looking closely at Anaheim and their what we call a hybrid model of those two things. They are distinct but not separate from each other, in that the independent auditor has its own contract with the city manager's office to do a scope of work. The Civilian Oversight Committee has their own scope of work and are pulled together in a different way, of course, and it's a volunteer group. But certainly the independent auditor can inform and support the Civilian Oversight group as they have needs that the auditor could respond to. So I hope that answers your question. Other questions? Or the chief or Allison feel like you want to add anything?
No, I was gonna see if there's questions first, but I guess the other piece that I'll add is, and I've gotten asked this a few times, is what do our officers think of the chat team and alternative response model? And I can tell you that they're extremely supportive of it. Our officers regularly are calling for our chat team to come over when they are on scene of calls, and that team has really only gotten positive feedback from our officers to the point where they just want more of them.
Thanks, Chief. Mr. Costello, hello, nice to see you. Yes, Allison, you can absolutely tell me if this is not correct, but if somebody has suggestions or information that they'd like to offer, would they reach out to you directly or someone in your office? Oh, just like that. There's your email address. So yes, you can reach out to Allison and her email address is in the chat. And I'll just say too that, yeah, that December 13th deadline is what I would also offer to community members, that they're fast at work trying to pull this together by then. Chief, what level of education and experience do the outreach workers have?
So currently we don't require them to be licensed social workers. What we did when we stood this program up is if you guys are familiar, we had prior back in I think it was 2018, 2019, we had MOES, the Modesto Emergency or Outdoor Emergency Shelter. If you guys remember that, we worked a lot with our social services in the county, telecare, and different places like that, and got to know a lot of people in the social services industry that are well connected in the city. And so we did hire our outreach workers. They're not required to be licensed, but they are required to have several years of experience in social work in preference in our community. So I believe the team that we have right now is a really good team, but we were just having that conversation. I came back from a conference over the weekend and looking at what other agencies across the country are doing. And some require them to be licensed social workers, some require them to be mental health clinicians, some require that there's some type of somebody like an RN or somebody in the medical field. We don't require that at this point, but it's something we're continually evaluating. But I think it's 2 years of social work experience, I think, is what our minimum requirements are, I believe.
Yeah, and to be clear, just to make sure we're continuing to make the distinction, like that's for our chat program versus MCERT, which is a required, like a licensed clinician to ride along with our officers versus the outreach workers. We're not requiring that clinical level of education.
Yeah, thank you for that distinction. Thank you.
Vivian Lopez, I love your question so much. And I first just want to say that, so for those who maybe aren't looking at the chat, the question is, there's some data that showed Latino youth are responsible for 61% of youth crimes. Which city agency would help address this issue? So one thing I'd like to say is that in the Forward Together work group, this issue arose early. based on data provided to us by Modesto Police Department, the group was very easily able to come around this issue that many of our Latino young people are disproportionately engaging with law enforcement. And so the group has that written into the recommendation that the police department be assessing and paying attention to what conditions might be leading to more young Latino men specifically engaging with law enforcement versus other groups of folks, groups of young people. As someone who does the kind of like systems change work that I do, what I would say, and this is likely not a helpful response, is that addressing that issue belongs to a lot of agencies. I don't know that I could point to a single agency that is responsible for addressing that issue. I think that we all play a part. So the police department taking a hard look at whether any of their practices or policies or any of those things might be creating a situation like this would be really important. But I also think engaging neighborhoods and schools and other government agencies and churches and all those types of things to be thinking about what conditions make it more likely that our Latino young people are more responsible for crime is a really important community conversation that needs to be happening. So I hope that feels responsive.
And I would just add to show the importance of the conversation between us and the community is like Kate said, this was came from one of our bias-based policing audits that we do annually. It was an annual report that came out. And so when this was brought up initially, it made us think, okay, you know, because as anybody it would, man, if we have a disproportionate number of young Latinos being contacted by the police and being arrested, you know, what does that mean? And so we started looking for more data. I think data is information, doesn't necessarily mean anything. But one thing that we did find is we went to Modesto City Schools and said, okay, we got our young people. What's the demographics of students enrolled in Modesto City Schools? Because we know the demographic of Hispanics in our community is a little north of 40%. So you have 60% of youth being contacted. Wow. Well, if you actually look at Modesto City School data, their enrollment rate of Hispanics is 60%. And so what does that mean? Yet to be determined. I think that's continued conversations that we need to have. But I think that becomes another piece of information that is thrown into the conversation that we continue to talk about as we peel back the layers and dig into what this is. So just throw that out there. And that was kind of those questions that we developed with the Forward Together committee as people were asking questions led us to go, well, let's go find some more information out. And I think is ultimately very helpful.
Thanks, Chief. Trudy, appreciate your comment about your enthusiasm. Thank you. And Ken, hi, says that the recommendations on civilian oversight, independent auditor, and alternative response are excellent and were arrived at by a wide cross-section of our community, including police. Yes. Has there been any opposition? So I'll just say briefly that, you know, we had opposition very early on when the council started talking about doing this. But the general response from community has been supportive. Chief, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about like what it feels like for your staff.
Yeah.
Whether there's been any opposition there.
Yeah, I think anytime that there is, I wouldn't necessarily say change, but there is perceived change, there is perceived unknowns. Something is going to be implemented that officers don't know how that's going to affect them. I think there's always going to be some type of anxiety and nervousness about how does that affect me and what I do in my daily job, right? And so I think we've definitely had that, and I think people are, because if you look at civilian oversight, you know, just the term civilian oversight and police agencies, it has historically been a very adversarial topic. It is police oversight is looking to go, you know, find all the wrongdoings of cops and arrest cops and fire cops and things like that. And I think that's just been historically the challenge that we've tried to overcome. I think when you look at it from a lens of how do we make our community better, and you look at it a lens of how do we police more effectively, then that's why I think the Forward Together committee arrived at the Anaheim model, because it's a cooperative model that really, at the end of the day, tries to make our community better through every aspect of what we do. And so that has been a challenge where it's been my charge, and it's been Kate and I have met with officers and tried to explain to them what this looks like, what it does, and the benefits of having something like this. And so I wouldn't say anybody's opposed, but I think that people are definitely naturally, I think I would be very concerned about how does that affect me and what doing my job. Because I can tell you, our police officers feel I go out there and try to do the best I can every single day. And am I going to be judged fairly? At the end of the day, that's all anybody wants, right? Is to be judged fairly. And I think that we'll get there. I think that we'll be okay. But I would say that there is some nervousness on the side of the police officers.
Yeah, I think that the only thing I would add to that is that often, so two things actually, when we heard the presentations from communities who had things like civilian oversight and independent auditors, just like the chief said, the opposition or resistance came when there was missing information, a lack of strong relationships, bad communication, a lack of trust. And I think that the way the Forward Together work group rolled out, we gave people within the department and in the community the opportunity to learn together and to screw things up and then to fix it and have everything be okay. And that doesn't stop when the recommendations are formed. So I'm quite proud that we have a city and a police department that really gets that this is ongoing work, that sometimes developing these recommendations can have, unintentional consequences, like, eroding the culture of a police department or any number of other things. So ongoing attention is being paid to how we create the right conditions for all of this to be as successful as possible for everyone involved.
And the only other, and just to add one tidbit is, I think the Forward Together process showed that this all could work, because we had our police officers with subject matter experts and different things about our police department, policies and procedures and all these things, come in and do presentations and ask questions. And I think it was an opportunity for our police officers to get to know a wide cross-section of our community, and that wide cross-section of our community to get to know our police officers. And on top of that, we've been holding, it's not related to this, what we're talking about specifically, but we're holding community relations classes. And Kate mentioned Michael Baldwin, one of our co-facilitators. We're working with him and actually bringing the community and minority community members and police officers together through these relationship building courses. And we're finding that it's just amazingly beneficial to get everybody to kind of see the perspective through each other's eyes a little bit. And I think when we do that, we understand that we're all, at the end of the day, wanting to be safe, secure, protected in our community. And it's a positive thing all the way around.
So a couple questions from Vivian. So MERT, Major Incident Review Team. So as we have described in the recommendations and other places, that's stakeholders reviewing major, or I think that, well, Chief, I'm just going to let you speak to whether or not that team already exists.
Great. So no, it does not currently exist. We are going to be implementing that. So and taking a lead out of Anaheim, what we do when we have major incidents within the police department, officer involved shooting or in custody death or something like that, we do what we call a 72-hour review. So within 72 hours of an incident, I have my executive staff, we have one of our attorneys, we have our internal affairs unit come and give me a brief within 72 hours of what we know right now. And it's not to decide if something's within policy, out of policy, legal, not legal. It's to really look at, are there any immediate things that we need to change right now, policies, procedures, equipment, what do we need, things like that, and evaluate it from that perspective. And what the Anaheim does is they also have 72-hour briefs, but they have what they call a major incident review team as well. And that's 10 days after an incident. 10 days after an incident, it's a bigger group of people. They bring their executive staff in, they bring the independent auditor in, they bring the union in, and they do a very similar review of what do we know right now. And then they look at all of those, they look at command and control, they look at 7 different topics, and then they have potential action items that come out of that, of again, not whether it's justified, not justified, within policy, not out of policy, but what's tactics, training, policies, procedures, based on what happened, is there anything that we need to change or look at immediately? And so that's been a huge benefit from what I understand. Anaheim has really talked that up when the Forward Together team looked at it, or the Forward Together committee looked at it. And even when I looked at it, I see that as a very beneficial team. And so regardless of whether we would move forward with independent auditor or a civilian oversight committee, the MERT team is absolutely something we're going to be implementing here as well.
And then part two was also Vivian calling out one of the recommendations about protect community civil rights during interactions with the police, and this idea that educating the community and youth about their rights. Just wondering who would do that. So Chief, I don't know if you have, I mean, what I can say is that that's a recommendation the work group made, and the implementation of that has yet to be designed about who would do that. But I think the hope was that it would be a partnership between law enforcement and community groups. Chief, I don't know if you have anything to add, or Allison, on that.
No, you said it right. But again, some of the things we're looking at is the, in Anaheim, for instance, that they send their police review board members to NACOL. You guys are probably familiar, some of you are familiar with NACOL. It's the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, if I think I got that right. And and they send them to conferences and training. We've talked about if there is an independent auditor like OIR, it could be advisory to the committee and do that type of training. And then of course we have people within the police department that could explain our policies and procedures as well. So I agree with Kate. It's probably going to be a partnership amongst many different partners, but that's yet to be determined exactly what that would look like.
And then Ken, you asked a really great question, because we've been thinking about this quite a bit. The question is, will the city council vote on December 13th be taken by the current council or the newly elected council? And the answer is it will be taken by the newly elected council. So for those of you who, I'm assuming most people are aware that like our council, we're getting ready for an election. You guys are the League of Women Voters. And we have 3 council seats that we know 2 are running unopposed, and then we have the Naramson and Jeremiah seat that is open as well. And I can say more about that. It certainly presents some challenges, but I can say that those gentlemen have been at the presentations that have been offered to the city council by the manager's office. They've been taking a lot of notes. I have seen them meeting with the chief. I have met with them to try to address any questions, concerns, ideas. The hope is that we're bringing them along before they even end up in that chair. And it's time for them to vote on this part of the recommendations. So. Allison says also that all the candidates were invited to attend the workshop we did on the 29th. And by we, I mean Allison. She, did a beautiful job of illustrating what civilian oversight could look like and what an independent auditor could look like. And all the candidates were there. Other questions or comments? I guess I would just offer some parting thoughts, and certainly invite the chief and Allison. I know there wasn't a whole lot of questions other than how people could send you information for the city. But, one of the things we said from the very beginning is what a shame it would be if we got to the end of this and all we got was a set of recommendations. That for over a year, we had community stakeholder groups, the public, law enforcement in the same room, asking hard questions and having hard conversations. And I feel really proud and confident of the work that this group did. We closed some gaps in terms of like missing information. We built some really good relationships amongst unlikely folks and stakeholder groups who are in relationship with each other. And I find that a lot of people are asking really important questions, and it's much less adversarial. And their work is not done. Our work is not done. The work group itself is officially done. But as I hope we've illustrated, it's not just like, here's your recommendations, go do these things and everything's fine. Change work takes ongoing attention. And I think that you all should be very proud of our city for the work that it's willing to do, even though we don't always get it right. James says, will the Sorry, Julie, I just saw one more question pop up. Is that okay?
Yeah, go.
Will the community be able to see the city recommendations before the council votes? Allison.
At the risk of a poor internet connection, I'm going to try and answer. The recommendations, the next time that they're anticipated to be before the community will be at the December 13th meeting. However, they will be out in advance of that meeting on as an agenda item that the community will have access to be able to review prior to the meeting and provide feedback at that meeting, whether it be in person or via Zoom.
The other thing that I would just say too is that part of the conversations we've been having about how to build the oversight group and work with an independent auditor. And one of the things that I think was a lesson learned from the other communities that we spoke to was the importance of our ability to pivot if it's necessary. So what comes before the council on the 13th, I'm confident will be solid and really well designed. And if it's well designed, it will also be flexible in that the world will change and we'll learn things as we go through this, and what doesn't work needs to be tossed out and what works we need to do more of. So yeah, we'll learn along the way. It won't be done on the 13th.
Well, I think we're at the end of our questions and you have given us a lot of information. Thank you so much, Kate. And thank you, Brandon Gillespie, also, all the information you've provided to us. I feel much more up to date on what's going on with this whole situation. So we really appreciate your help. And this is going to end up being posted, I believe, on YouTube and possibly available through our League of Women Voters of Stanislaus County website. So if you've got friends who might be interested, let them know it is going to be available. And thank you all so much for being here.
Great. Thank you very much.